Welcome back to Daily Gossip, the podcast where we usually sift through the noise to find the stories that actually matter. I know the name says in quote, gossip and quote, but today we aren't in oppos. Talking about Hollywood breakups or royal family dramas. Today, we are diving into the highest stakes gossip on the planet. The whispered truths, the blatant fabrications, and the geopolitical spin echoing through the halls of Washington and Beijing. If you are tuning in from Europe, the United States, or anywhere in the Americas, and you've been feeling the pinch of inflation, the anxiety of volatile markets, or just a general sense of unease about the direction of the global economy, grab a coffee or a glass of wine. You are going to want to hear this. We need to have a serious, unfiltered conversation about U.S. President Donald Trump's highly publicized visit to China this May. If you have been watching the mainstream cable news networks or scrolling through official White House press releases, you have likely been bombarded with a very specific, carefully curated narrative. Trump returned from Beijing proclaiming a monumental success. He has been standing at podiums, boasting of sweeping, historic gains for the United States, painting a picture of a resurgent American empire single-handedly dictating terms on the global stage. He wants you to believe that he marched into Beijing, slammed his fist on the table, and forced the Chinese leadership into submission. Well, several days have now passed since the dust settled on the tarmac. The cameras have been packed away, the diplomatic pleasantries have evaporated, and a much clearer, far more sobering picture is emerging from the economic and political fallout. And having combed through the data, the international reactions, and the hard economic metrics, we can conclusively say that the administration's narrative is an illusion. It is a carefully constructed mirage. Trump's trip to China was not a triumph. It was, by virtually every meaningful measure, a profound failure. He flew across the globe believing he could leverage raw American power to extract concessions that would magically cure his domestic headaches. Instead, he hit a brick wall. He encountered a Chinese leadership that was resolutely, almost coldly, uninterested in bailing him out. Today, we are going to meticulously fact-check the claims emanating from the Oval Office, peeling back the layers of spin to show you exactly how misleading they truly are, and more importantly, what this means for your wallet, your security, and the global order. To truly understand the absurdity of the White House's claims, we have to recognize that this failure was not a surprise. In fact, it was entirely predictable to anyone who has been paying attention to international relations over the last decade. No serious geopolitical analyst, no seasoned economist in London, Frankfurt, or New York genuinely expected a breakthrough. Why? Because for nearly 10 years, the United States has been locked in an aggressive, escalating trade and technology war against China. It is one of the very few things that Democrats and Republicans in Washington actually agree on. Trump initiated this conflict back in 2018. It was then quietly but firmly sustained, and even institutionalized, by the Biden administration. But when Trump assumed his second term at the beginning of 2025, he threw gasoline on the fire. He massively escalated the hostilities. Let us rewind just a few months to August of 2025. This is vital context. Before demanding that Beijing bend the knee, Trump was publicly, aggressively boasting that the United States held in quote, incredible cards in quote, that could, and I quote, end quote, destroy China, end quote, end quote. That was the actual language being deployed by the leader of the free world. He was actively threatening the economic ruin of a global superpower. Now, I ask you to look at this from a basic logical standpoint. If you are Chinese President Xi Jinping, and your adversary has spent a decade trying to strangle your tech sector, taxing your exports to the brink, and publicly threatening your destruction, why on earth would you suddenly pivot to accommodate them? Why would Beijing offer a political lifeline to a U.S. president who is responsible for immense global friction? And when I say friction, I am talking about the realities that affect all of us listening today. I am talking about the deeply destabilizing conflict in Iran, the punishing tariffs that end up acting as a tax on Western consumers, and the widespread supply chain disruptions that have made everything from building a house to buying a laptop more expensive. China simply has zero strategic incentive to appease a nation that has dedicated the last 10 years to undermining its ascent. This is exactly why the consensus among international observers is so bleak. It ISN and Oppos, just left-leaning critics saying this. If you look across the Atlantic, the European foreign policy publication Modern Diplomacy aptly described the visit as a, and quote, failure foretold, and quote. The Guardian in the UK, a highly respected broadsheet, characterized the encounter as a, and quote, stalemate summit, and quote, concluding quite bluntly that virtually nothing of substance was achieved. But perhaps the most damning indictment comes from within the American media landscape itself, specifically from a network you would expect to run interference for the administration. Take a look at CBS News. They recently published a sobering analysis titled, and quote, Trump talks up trade deals with China, but experts see no big wins for U.S., end quote. What makes this headline so remarkable is the current ownership of CBS. The network is part of Paramount, which is now controlled by the Ellison family. For those who don an oppose, Tino, Larry Ellison is one of the wealthiest billionaire oligarchs on the planet, a staunch right-wing supporter, and a major ally of Donald Trump. His son, David Ellison, is currently overseeing the CBS empire. Yet, despite being owned by a pro-Trump billionaire family, CBS News could not hide the reality of the situation. Their journalists interviewed a former negotiator from the U.S. Trade Representative and Oppo's office who bluntly stated that Trump and his team appeared to have very little to show for their efforts. When even your billionaire backers' media conglomerates are forced to admit you failed, the writing is truly on the wall. So, let us dig into the specifics. I have been analyzing the official fact sheet published by the White House, a document that audaciously claims the administration secured, in quote, historic deals, end quote, that will deliver for American workers, farmers, and domestic industry. Right out of the gate, we have to dismantle the populist illusion that this trip was ever about the working class. If you are a factory worker in Michigan, a teacher in Yorkshire, or a small business owner in Toronto, you need to understand who actually had a seat at the table in Beijing. Trump did not arrive flanked by labor union leaders, advocates for the middle class, or representatives of struggling manufacturing towns. He arrived with an entourage of the most powerful billionaire CEOs and oligarchs in the corporate world. When Trump sat down with top Chinese government officials, he was surrounded by men like Elon Musk, Apple's Tim Cook, Nvidia's Jensen Huang, and Blackstone's Steven Schwarzman. The optics were undeniable. It made it unequivocally, embarrassingly clear that the primary objective of this summit was securing market access for multinational conglomerates, not protecting domestic jobs or fighting for the average citizen. The entire framing of the White House press release is a deliberate, cynical obfuscation designed to sound good on the evening news while serving the interests of the boardroom. Putting that staggering hypocrisy aside for a moment, let us examine the actual substance of the claims made in this document. The fact sheet opens with a massive assertion regarding geopolitics. It claims that the United States and China achieved a consensus regarding Iran and the absolute necessity of keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. To the untrained eye, this sounds like a massive diplomatic victory. Peace in the Middle East secured by American strength. However, this is a masterful piece of misdirection. While it is technically true that both nations agree the strait should remain open, their definitions of the word, end quote, open, end quote, and their fundamental stances on the broader Iranian conflict are diametrically opposed. From the very inception of the U.S.-initiated aggression against Iran, China has been fiercely, consistently critical. Beijing has repeatedly demanded an immediate cessation of American military attacks. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio recently tried to spin this by saying that Iran agrees with the U.S. on preventing the militarization of the strait. But let an oppose be honest, that is a disingenuously low bar. Of course, China desires the uninterrupted flow of global trade. The Strait of Hormuz is a vital artery for the global economy. But wanting trade to flow does not, in any way, translate to an endorsement of U.S. military operations. If we look at the analysis from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a prominent anti-war think tank in Washington, D.C., the reality becomes glaringly obvious. Trita Parsi, an incredibly knowledgeable expert on West Asian geopolitics, pointed out that China's UN ambassador actively criticized a U.S.-led resolution concerning the strait. You see, for Beijing, end quote, open, end quote, strait simply means unimpeded commercial traffic. It means oil tankers, natural gas carriers, and cargo ships can move freely. And here is the critical detail that the mainstream narrative conveniently ignores. Iran is not blockading Chinese vessels. Chinese ships continue to pass through the region without issue. The current militarized blockade, the actual bottleneck causing global anxiety, is being enforced by the U.S. military, not by Tehran. Furthermore, as analysts have pointed out, China is not even inherently opposed to the idea of ships paying fees to transit the area. They have pragmatically suggested reframing the levies that Iran wants to charge as an, end quote, environmental management fee, end quote, that would be applicable to states in the Persian Gulf. They are looking for a diplomatic, bureaucratic workaround, not a military confrontation. Therefore, the White House and Oppo's assertion that there is a U.S.-China consensus on Iran is a gross misrepresentation of reality. Beijing continues to view Washington as the primary aggressor in the region and is demanding a diplomatic resolution, not cheering on American gunboats. Moving further down the administration and Oppo's list of supposed victories, the White House heralded the creation of new, bilateral boards for trade and investment. To the casual listener, this sounds like progress. It sounds like two superpowers sitting down to hash out their differences. But anyone who has spent time observing government bureaucracy knows that this is nothing more than political theater. It is highly unlikely that anything of tangible substance will ever materialize from these newly minted committees. They are classic, superficial deliverables. They exist solely to allow politicians to stand in front of a camera and claim they did something, masking the fact that they achieved nothing. If you want to know what is really happening with international trade, you have to look at the macroeconomic trends, and those trends reveal a story of quiet, steady separation. Trade between the United States and China, as a percentage of overall volume, has been declining for years. And importantly, this decline is being driven heavily by the Chinese side. China is not waiting around for the U.S. to decide its fate. It is actively, aggressively diversifying its economic partnerships. Today, China and Oppo's largest trading partner is no longer the United States, nor is it the European Union. It is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Beijing is pivoting. It is increasingly prioritizing South-South cooperation, building massive infrastructure projects and fostering unbreakable economic ties across the global South. What we are witnessing is the slow, deliberate machinery of economic decoupling. It ISN and Oppo's going to happen overnight, and it one and Oppo's be an immediate catastrophic rupture, but it is the definitive, undeniable long-term trajectory of the 21st century. So, ask yourself, given the unrelenting, unpredictable nature of the U.S. trade and technology war, why on earth would China increase its reliance on American markets? Why would they pour investments into the U.S., knowing full well that those assets could be frozen, heavily taxed, or weaponized by whoever happens to occupy the Oval Office 4 years from now? They Wooden and Oppo's These new trade boards are mere formalities, empty diplomatic gestures designed to paper over a rapidly deepening geopolitical divide. But the illusion doesn't and Oppo's stop at trade boards. The White House fact sheet specifically highlights several industries where they claim minor agreements were reached, touting them as hard-won victories. Let and Oppo's take a look at the issue of rare earths and critical minerals. The administration proudly stated that China has agreed to, and quote, address U.S. concerns, and quote, regarding supply chain shortages in this sector. I want you to pay close attention to that phrasing, and quote, address U.S. concerns, and quote. It is incredibly weak, vague, and entirely non-committal. To understand what is actually happening here, we have to look at the cause and effect. Earlier in 2025, the Trump administration significantly escalated the trade war. They threatened punitive, crushing tariffs of up to 145% on Chinese goods. Simultaneously, they imposed stringent export restrictions designed to deny China access to crucial artificial intelligence chips. This was a heavy-handed, calculated attempt to permanently stifle Chinese technological advancement. And how did China respond? They didn't an Oppo's roll over. They engaged in direct, proportional retaliation by imposing their own export restrictions on rare earths. This was a devastating counterpunch. China exercises near-total, monopolistic dominance over the global supply chain for critical minerals. They control everything from the extraction in the mines to the complex processing required to make them usable. These elements are not just nice-to-haves. They are absolutely vital. They are the essential ingredients for civilian technologies like electric vehicles and the smartphone in your pocket, but more importantly, they are the irreplaceable bedrock of the U.S. military-industrial complex. American defense contractors literally cannot manufacture advanced fighter jets, missile guidance systems, or radar arrays without Chinese rare earths. So, when China restricted these exports, it was not an unprovoked act of aggression. It was a calibrated, highly effective act of self-defense against aggressive U.S. policies. It was Beijing saying, and quote, "If you try to cut off our tech, we will cut off your military supply lines," end quote. And now, after triggering this massive crisis, Trump flies to Beijing, secures a vague promise that China will, end quote, address concerns, end quote, and attempts to spin it as a diplomatic triumph. The fundamental, unvarnished truth is that this supply chain crisis only existed because the White House instigated it. The so-called agreement represents nothing more than a tentative, shaky step back toward the status quo that existed before the administration and Oppo's disastrous escalation. Claiming the resolution of a self-inflicted wound as a glorious victory is the absolute height of political absurdity. We see the exact same pattern of self-inflicted damage disguised as victory in the aviation sector. The White House proudly announced that China had approved the purchase of 200 Boeing aircraft. On paper, it sounds like a massive win for American manufacturing. But the financial markets are far less gullible than the voting public. As Reuters reported, Boeing shares actually dropped by 4% immediately following the announcement. Why would a company and Oppo's stock drop after a major sale? Because context is everything. Prior to the administration and Oppo's heavy-handed interventions and the ensuing trade tensions, industry analysts and Boeing executives had fully anticipated China ordering upwards of 500 jets. This was supposed to be a colossal, multi-year pipeline of revenue. Instead, the U.S. president flew across the globe, flanked by Boeing executives, only to secure an order less than half the size of what was originally expected. That is not a victory. That is a demonstrably massive loss of market share. It is hundreds of lost contracts, directly attributable to the volatile, toxic business climate fostered by U.S. trade policies. Boeing and Oppo's investors saw right through the spin, recognizing that the company is losing ground in the world and Oppo's most lucrative aviation market. And the story repeats itself almost comically in the agricultural sector. Trump boasted that China would commit to purchasing $17 billion annually in U.S. agricultural products, particularly soybeans, and that they would restore market access for American beef and poultry. It sounds like a great day for the farmers in the Midwest. But let and Oppo's apply some critical thinking here. President Xi Jinping did not wake up one morning and capriciously decide he simply hated American soybeans. These restrictions were explicitly, deliberately implemented as leverage. They were direct retaliation against unilateral U.S. trade and tech wars. When faced with the existential threat of 145% tariffs, Beijing did what any rational actor would do. They targeted politically sensitive U.S. exports to inflict maximum pain on the administration and Oppo's voting base. They squeezed the American farm. Now, having caused the initial disruption and put thousands of agricultural businesses in jeopardy, Trump visits China. The retaliatory measures are slightly eased, and he stands before the cameras declaring a massive win. Once again, the administration is popping champagne to celebrate a return to the status quo ante. They are desperately trying to mask the fact that years of trade war have yielded absolutely no net positive results. All it has generated is unnecessary friction, lost revenue, and profound economic anxiety for the very American workers they claim to protect. But perhaps the most glaring, most damning part of the White House press release is not what it says, but what it omits. The complete silence on the issue of semiconductors is deafening, and the reason they aren't and Oppo's talking about it is because the U.S. suffered a definitive, undeniable strategic defeat on this front. Before he even boarded the plane for the summit, Trump was publicly complaining that China was blocking domestic tech companies from purchasing chips from Nvidia. Now, if you follow the stock market, you know that Nvidia is currently the most valuable company on the planet, boasting a staggering market capitalization of over $5.5 trillion. They are the absolute, undisputed kings of designing the advanced graphics processing units, or GPUs, that are necessary for artificial intelligence development. Jensen Huang, the billionaire CEO of Nvidia, was an Appos, just tagging along on this trip. He actually flew on Air Force One. His presence on the presidential aircraft underscores just how desperate Nvidia is to regain access to the Chinese market. You see, Nvidia used to control 95% of the Chinese market for advanced chips. It was a golden goose. But then the US government stepped in. Driven by a desire to maintain an absolute American monopoly on artificial intelligence, Washington imposed severe export restrictions, explicitly forbidding Nvidia from selling its best technology to China. As a direct result, Nvidia and Appos' market share in China plummeted from 95% to absolute zero. The strategy was simple. Starve China of the hardware, and they won, and Appos' be able to compete in the AI race. Unsurprisingly, China refused to accept a future of complete technological subjugation. Instead of giving up, the Chinese government reacted to the American blockade by accelerating their own industrial policy. They poured billions upon billions of dollars into fostering a robust, entirely self-sufficient domestic chip ecosystem. And this is where the story shifts from tragic to almost comical. The US government eventually realized that their export restrictions had spectacularly backfired. They were bleeding American champions like Nvidia dry while simultaneously acting as the greatest catalyst imaginable for Chinese tech independence. So, in a desperate bid to undo the damage, the administration attempted a massive reversal. Trump announced the easing of restrictions, grandly declaring that Chinese firms would once again be allowed to purchase Nvidia and Appos' slightly downgraded H200 chip. He expected gratitude. He expected Chinese companies to come rushing back with open checkbooks. Yet, as Trump later lamented to the press, Beijing simply wasn't Appos' interested. China understands the strategic vulnerability of reliance on Western technology. They have learned their lesson. They remain firmly, irrevocably committed to indigenous innovation. The New York Times, in its typically understated fashion, phrased it delicately, saying that Nvidia and Appos' future in China remains, and quote, unclear, end quote. Reuters, however, was much blunter. They noted that despite official US government approval to sell the chips, not a single Nvidia H200 chip has been delivered to a Chinese company. Let that sink in. The United States tried to weaponize its technological dominance. Failed. It realized its mistake, tried to reverse course, and was flatly, humiliatingly rebuffed by the very market it was trying to control. It is an absolute masterclass in strategic miscalculation, and it highlights the waning leverage of Western tech monopolies. When you take a step back and examine the granular details across every single issue we and Appos' discussed today, from the geopolitics of the Middle East, to the aviation orders of Boeing, to the supply chains of rare earths, to the cutting-edge realm of advanced semiconductors, the grand narrative of a triumphant Beijing summit completely collapses under its own weight. The claims that the US administration successfully coerced China into beneficial concessions are entirely, verifiably divorced from reality. Historically, we must acknowledge the United States has been incredibly successful at imposing its will on the world. For decades, Washington has forced the comprador elites of weaker, developing nations to implement policies that enrich Western multinational corporations, often at the profound expense of local populations and working classes. It is a playbook that has worked in Latin America, in parts of Africa, and across various global spheres of influence. But China represents an entirely different paradigm. The Chinese leadership demonstrated an unwavering, ironclad commitment to its own long-term economic development. They possess the scale, the capital, and the strategic foresight to refuse to yield to American pressure. They simply will not allow foreign corporations or hostile administrations to dictate their internal terms. This outcome is more than just a diplomatic misfire. It is a profound, historic embarrassment for the current administration. Think about the sheer concentration of power that was mobilized for this trip. The US arrived with the absolute zenith of American corporate might, a cadre of billionaires who control trillions of dollars in capital, all of them desperate for access to a market of 1.4 billion people, a nation that boasts the largest expanding middle class on the face of the earth. And despite bringing the heaviest hitters capitalism has to offer, the U.S. delegation extracted zero meaningful, structural concessions. The irony of the situation is absolutely staggering. Just a few short months prior, the leader of the Western world was engaging in incredibly dangerous braggadocio, insisting he possessed the cards to utterly destroy the Chinese economy. He genuinely seemed to believe he could follow up those apocalyptic threats with a two-day diplomatic charm offensive and emerge as the undisputed victor. The cold, hard reality is that the U.S. failed to destroy China, and it failed to bend Beijing to its will. Instead of witnessing a master negotiator at work, what we are actually watching is the palpable desperation of an administration that is being forced to confront the failure of its own grand strategy. Every single attempt to contain China, to arrest its economic momentum, and to sabotage its technological trajectory, has faltered. The trade war that was initiated in 2018, blindly continued by the Biden administration, and then recklessly, aggressively escalated in 2025, has backfired with devastating consequences for the West. The tariffs that were supposedly designed to punish Beijing have instead acted as a massive, regressive tax on the American and European consumer. We were promised that these protectionist, America First policies would spark a glorious renaissance in domestic manufacturing. We were told they would bring back the well-paying industrial jobs of the 20th century. But if you look at the data, the reality has been the exact opposite. The extreme volatility, the endless trade threats, and the suffocating uncertainty generated by these policies have actually accelerated de-industrialization. Right now, as we speak, manufacturing jobs in the U.S. are on a downward trend, not a rising one. Companies cannot plan for the future when the rules of global trade are rewritten via late-night social media posts. And compounding all of these domestic woes is the terrifying resurgence of inflation, which is currently reaching its highest levels in 3 years. If you are listening to this and wondering why your grocery bill is climbing or why you can and oppose to afford to buy a house, you need to understand that this inflationary pressure is not an accident of nature. It is the direct, predictable result of global instability that has been severely exacerbated by terrible foreign policy. The lingering supply chain shocks resulting from the conflict in Eastern Europe have been exponentially compounded by the administration and oppose's unprovoked, disastrous military posturing against Iran. This kind of reckless military adventurism in the world and oppose's most critical energy corridor has caused crude oil prices to double. It has pushed gasoline prices to unsustainable, economically crippling highs in a matter of months. When energy costs double, the price of literally everything else, from the food on your table to the clothes on your back, skyrockets. So, with inflationary pressures mounting, consumer confidence plummeting, and economic anxiety reaching a boiling point just months before the crucial November midterm elections, the administration and oppose's desperation for a distracting foreign policy victory is entirely palpable. The president traveled to Beijing, dragging an entourage of Silicon Valley and Wall Street billionaires behind him, desperately hoping to extract a few flashy concessions. He needed a political bailout. He needed something, anything, to distract the public from the myriad domestic and international crises that his own policies had engineered. But China refused to play the role of political savior. They looked at the hand the U.S. was playing, called the bluff, and walked away from the table. What we are witnessing is a painful, real-time lesson in the unforgiving laws of geopolitics. Actions have consequences. Aggressive hubris, unbacked by leverage, cannot easily be unwound with a handshake and a photo op. The current administration spent years deliberately creating a complex, volatile, and hostile global environment. They shattered the supply chains, they sparked the trade wars, and they fanned the flames of military conflict. And now, as the election looms and the economy shudders, they are being forced to navigate the profound, inescapable geopolitical and economic fallout of their own making. As the old saying goes, they made their bed, and now the rest of us are being forced to lie in it. Thank you for spending part of your day with us here at Daily Gossip. We know the news can be heavy, but understanding the reality behind the political spin is the only way we can make informed decisions about our future, our investments, and our votes. If you found this deep dive valuable, please make sure to hit that subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review, share this episode with a friend who needs a reality check on the economy, and join our growing community of listeners who demand more than just sound bites. We rely on your support to keep peeling back the layers of these massive global stories. Stay curious, stay critical, and we will see you next time for more news that actually matters.